Tonight's story is called It Waits for Me. Chapter 1, A Premonition of Gloom. It was upon an evening most wretched that I returned to my ancestral home. The winds howled like a cacophony of tormented souls, and the sky, though sullen and overcast, seemed to bear down upon me with an oppressive weight. As I approached the dilapidated mansion, its dark silhouette rose against the bleak horizon, looming like a spectre of forgotten days. Ivy choked the once proud walls, and the windows, clouded with dust and decay, seemed to leer at me with hollow eyes. I had not visited the estate in many years, 15 to be precise, but an urgent letter from my elder cousin, Benedict, had compelled me to return. It had been vague, perhaps intentionally so, yet it bore an air of undeniable desperation. "Come at once," it had read. "There are matters I must speak of that cannot be written. Please do not delay." As the carriage rolled to a stop before the towering iron gates, rusted from neglect, a strange unease settled over me. Something about the place felt different. Not merely aged and decayed, but darker. It was as though some unseen malignancy had taken root in the very stones of the mansion. Yet I could not name it, nor did I dare to try. "Sir?" The coachman's voice shattered my reverie. His face, pale and gaunt, betrayed his own discomfort at the sight of the house. Shall I wait for you?" I glanced at him and saw in his eyes a pleading, as though he wished for nothing more than to turn and flee. "No," I replied, after a moment's hesitation. "You may return tomorrow. I'll stay the night." Even as I spoke the words, a chill slithered down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Reluctantly, the coachman nodded, and with a crack of his whip, the horses bolted away, as though eager to escape the foreboding gloom that clung to the estate. I stood there a moment longer, my breath visible in the cold evening air, before mustering the resolve to pass through the creaking gates. The path leading to the mansion was overgrown with weeds, and each step seemed to echo unnaturally in the desolate surroundings. The sun, now sinking below the horizon, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and writhe as though alive. I shivered, dismissing the notion as the product of an overactive imagination. Yet the feeling persisted. At last I reached the door, a massive oaken slab adorned with intricate carvings that had long since eroded with time. I rapped the heavy brass knocker 3 times. The sound reverberated through the empty halls beyond, but no answer came. After several moments of silence, I decided to try the door, and to my surprise, it swung open easily with a low, mournful creak. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and neglect. Dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through the windows, and the heavy velvet drapes, once crimson, now hung in tattered shrouds. The grand hall, which had once been a place of warmth and laughter, now stood as a monument to decay and desolation. "Hello?" I called, my voice echoing hollowly through the corridors. There was no reply. I stepped inside the door, closing behind me with a dreadful finality. As I made my way deeper into the house, a growing sense of unease gnawed at my mind. Though it had been many years since I last walked these halls, I couldn't shake the impression that something was terribly, horribly wrong. The silence was oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting, watching. At length, I found myself standing before the door to my cousin's study. The memory of this room was vivid in my mind. It had been Benedict's sanctuary, a place where he had spent countless hours engrossed in his various studies and experiments. With a trembling hand, I knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. No answer. I knocked again, more forcefully this time, but again there was only silence. My heart quickened. Something was terribly wrong. With mounting dread, I pushed the door open. The study was in a shambles. Books lay strewn across the floor, their pages torn and scattered like the remnants of some great storm. The fireplace, once a source of warmth, now stood cold and empty, its ashes undisturbed for what seemed like months. And there, slumped over the grand mahogany desk, was Benedict. A gasp escaped my lips as I rushed to his side. His once vibrant face was pale and drawn, his eyes, wide and staring, fixed on some unseen horror. He was dead. Of that, there could be no doubt. But it was not merely the fact of his death that filled me with terror. It was the expression on his face, frozen in a rictus of fear. In his hand, clutched tightly, even in death, was a piece of paper. With trembling fingers, I pried it from his grip and unfolded it. The writing was hurried, frantic, as though he had penned it in the throes of some unspeakable terror. The words themselves made little sense, yet they sent a chill through my very soul. They are in the shadows. They watch. And they wait. There is no escape. I staggered back, the paper falling from my hands. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I struggled to comprehend the meaning of the note. What had Benedict been afraid of? What had driven him to such madness in his final moments? It was then, as I stood in the flickering light of the dying candles, that I noticed it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, the shadows seemed to shift, to pulse with a life of their own. And for the briefest of moments, I thought I saw something there. Something dark, something monstrous, lurking in the shadows. The days that followed passed in a blur, as though time itself had grown sluggish and distorted. The authorities came, of course, but they found nothing, no sign of foul play, no indication of what had driven Benedict to his untimely demise. They attributed his death to natural causes, perhaps a heart attack brought on by stress, and they dismissed the frantic scribblings on the note as the ravings of a man who had obviously lost his mind. But I knew better. Something in that house had unsettled my cousin, something that had been watching him, waiting for him, and had finally claimed him in the end. Though I tried to convince myself that it was merely the product of grief and imagination, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, too. The shadows seemed deeper, darker than I remembered, and at night I would hear strange noises, faint whispers that danced at the edge of my consciousness, just beyond the threshold of perception. I began to explore the mansion, searching for some clue as to what had happened. Benedict had always been a private man, but I knew that his studies had taken a darker turn in recent years. He had become obsessed with ancient texts, obscure rituals, and forbidden knowledge. I found his notes scattered all over the house, fragments of thought and theory that hinted at something far more sinister than I could have imagined. He wrote of shadows that moved with purpose, of entities that existed just beyond the veil of our world, unseen but ever present. His research had led him to believe that these beings, shadowy creatures, could be summoned, or worse, that they could slip through into our reality of their own accord if one were not careful. At first, I dismissed these writings as the delusions of a man who had spent too much time alone with his books. But as the days wore on, I began to question my own sanity. The house felt alive, as though it were watching me, as though the very walls were whispering secrets in a language I could not understand. And always, there were the shadows, those creeping, unnatural shadows that seemed to pulse and shift when I wasn't looking. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the study once more. The room had been cleaned, Benedict's body removed, but the atmosphere remained oppressive, as though the air itself had been tainted by his death. I sat at his desk, in my mind racing with thoughts of his research and of the things he had written. There in the shadows, they watch and they wait. What had he seen in his final moments? And what had driven him to such madness? As I pondered these questions, the fire in the hearth flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. The candles, too, sputtered out one by one, until I was left alone in the cold, suffocating gloom. And then I heard it, a faint whisper so soft that I thought it must be my imagination. But it grew louder, more distinct, until I could no longer deny its presence. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice. Not human, not animal, but something else. Something in the shadows. Trembling, I lit a match and hastily relit the candles. The light banished the darkness, but only for a moment. As I glanced toward the far corner of the room, my heart seized with terror. The shadows were moving again. This time there could be absolutely no doubt. The darkness seemed to pulse and writhe as though something was stirring within it. Something alive. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, transfixed by the unnatural sight. And then, from within the deepest recesses of the shadows, a pair of eyes emerged, glowing, malevolent eyes that stared directly into my soul. I bolted from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt like a maze, its corridors twisting and turning in ways I could not comprehend. Every shadow seemed alive, every corner held some unseen threat. The whispers that followed me, growing louder, more insistent, filled my mind, drowning out all rational thought. At last, I reached my room and slammed the door behind me. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were gone, but the terror remained. I knew now what had driven Benedict to his death. There was something in the shadows, something that was ancient and malevolent, and it was coming for me. The night that followed was the longest I had ever endured. Sleep eluded me, chased away by the incessant whispering and the relentless sense of being watched. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch unnaturally, curling along the floors and walls like smoke, threatening to consume me if I so much as closed my eyes. When at last the first pale light of dawn seeped through the heavy curtains, I rose, exhausted but resolute. I knew that I could not stay in this house much longer. Whatever haunted these halls and had claimed Benedict's mind and soul was now closing in on me. But to leave without understanding and just to flee blindly into the unknown, it felt like cowardice. So I decided no. I had to know what had driven my cousin to such madness. I had to know what lurked in the shadows. That morning I began a thorough search of Benedict's private quarters. His study had yielded little but madness, and yet I could not shake the feeling that there was something more, something hidden away in the recesses of the house, some final piece of the puzzle that would explain his cryptic warnings. The mansion itself was vast, with rooms upon rooms that had been abandoned for years. The once gleaming wood of the banisters had dulled, and the rich tapestries that had lined the corridors had long faded, the remnants of their former grandeur. As I searched through forgotten closets and crumbling shelves, I unearthed relics of a long-dead family history, portraits of stern-looking ancestors, letters yellowed with age, and trinkets from forgotten travels. But there was nothing that spoke of the darkness I now sought to understand. I soon found myself in the east wing of the house, a section that had been sealed off for as long as I could remember. As children, I remembered Benedict and I had been forbidden to enter these rooms, and in our youth, we had just assumed it was simply because they were old and dangerous. But now, with the weight of what I had witnessed pressing down on me, I wondered if there had been another reason for the seclusion of this part of the house. The door to the east wing was locked, but after a few minutes of searching, I found a rusted key in one of Benedict's drawers. The lock gave way with a groan, and the door swung open to reveal a corridor thick with dust. The air was stale, and the light dim. The smell of rot was almost overpowering. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, my footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. The east wing was a world apart from the rest of the mansion. Where the other sections had been neglected, this one had been, utterly abandoned. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the furniture was covered in thick layers of dust. But as I moved through the silent rooms, a strange sensation began to creep over me. The feeling again that I was not alone. I pressed onward, driven by a growing sense of urgency, and at last I came to a door that was different from the others. It was smaller and more discreet, and unlike the others, it bore no sign of decay. In fact, the wood appeared almost untouched by time, its surface smooth and polished, as though someone had cared for it, even in the midst of the ruin around it. I hesitated before the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as though something on the other side was waiting for me. Steeling myself, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was clean, in fact, immaculately so. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with books, scrolls, and strange objects that I did not recognize. A desk sat in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with papers, ink bottles, and quills. But it wasn't the state of the room that gave me pause. It was the atmosphere. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and the shadows here seemed, alive, pulsing faintly as though responding to my presence. I stepped inside, drawn irresistibly to the desk. The papers scattered across its surface were written in Benedict's hand. But as I glanced over them, I realized these notes were far more coherent than the ravings I had found elsewhere in the house. They spoke of rituals, of ancient rites, designed to call forth entities from beyond the veil of our world. The texts Benedict had been studying were older than I had imagined. Older than the house itself, actually. Older than any history I'd ever known. And these were just not theoretical. Benedict had been practicing them. My hands shook as I sifted through the papers. There were diagrams, circles, inscribed with runes I could not decipher, symbols of unknown origin, and beneath them, in Benedict's increasingly frantic scrawl, he had written voices in the night of shadows that moved of their own accord. But the most chilling note, hastily scribbled and nearly illegible, caught my eye. I've opened the way. They're here. I've seen them. My breath caught in my throat. Benedict had opened a doorway, a passage into some other realm. He had allowed something into our world, something that now haunted the mansion. The paper slipped from my hands as I stumbled back, my heart racing. I had to leave, now. There was nothing more to be learned here, nothing more to discover. This house was cursed, tainted by whatever Benedict had unleashed, and if I stayed any longer, I feared I would suffer the same fate as he had. But as I turned to leave, a low guttural sound filled the room. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but it grew louder, deeper, until it reverberated through the very walls. My breath came in shallow gasps as I realized the source of the sound. It was coming from the shadows. I spun around, my eyes darting to the corners of the room, and there, within the darkest recesses of the space, the shadows began to shift. Slowly, inexorably, they coalesced, taking form. The darkness writhed, swirling like a living thing, until at last a figure began to emerge. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its body seemed to be made entirely of shadow, as though the very essence of night had taken on a terrible, twisted form. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless save for two glowing orbs where its eyes should have been. Eyes that burned with an unnatural, malevolent light. It regarded me with a predatory stillness, as though waiting, calculating. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my mind with their incoherent murmurs. They pressed in from all sides, a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think, to move. I felt myself slipping, my mind unraveling, as the entity before me loomed closer, its presence suffocating. In a blind panic, I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the thing stirring behind it, hear the whispering voices growing louder, more insistent, but I didn't look back. I ran through the corridors of the mansion, my heart pounding in my ears until I burst into the main hall. The front door loomed before me, and without a second thought, I flung it open and stumbled out into the cold evening air. The sky was darkening and the wind howled through the trees, but I didn't stop. I ran down the path, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until at last I reached the iron gates. Only then did I turn back. The mansion stood silent, its windows dark and empty, but in the fading light I saw them. Shadows moving within, writhing and twisting like dark tendrils. They pulsed as though alive, as though watching, waiting. I fled. I don't know how long I wandered after that. Days, perhaps weeks. Time had lost all meaning. I found myself in a nearby village, disoriented and feverish, my mind teetering on the edge of madness. The locals found me wandering in the streets, raving about shadows and whispers, and took me in. They were kind, but they didn't believe me. I mean, how could they? I scarcely believed it myself. But today the whispers have not ceased. They follow me, even here in the daylight, when there are no shadows to hide in. At night, they grow louder and more insistent. And I know they're waiting for me, for the moment when I will slip, when my mind falters, and they will claim me, as they did Benedict. I can't escape. There's something there, something ancient, something malevolent, and it's watching and waiting. I don't know how long I can resist, but when the darkness falls and the shadows creep once more into the corners of the room, I'll face them as Benedict did, and I fear that, like him, I won't survive.